Welcome to a Legendarium special about Zosimos of Panopolis, the first alchemist. In this episode, we will talk about how Zosimos' writings and theories influenced scholars for centuries. Alchemy began in ancient Egypt, where Egyptians used the word chem to describe the fertility of the floodplains around the Nile River. This may be where the word alchemy and chemistry come from. Egyptian beliefs in life after death and the mummification process they developed probably gave the Egyptians a basic knowledge of chemistry. They created complex magical and technical processes that they used alongside one another. Despite some real expansion in human knowledge, this remained supernatural in character. For example, some Egyptian scholars believed that one could turn lead into gold by adding egg yolks. Most Egyptian scholars remained in closed societies, using coded symbols that could only be read by the initiated. In this land of gods and gold, the search for wealth and the divine became one and the same. Yet ancient Egyptian knowledge would be democratized by Zosimos of Panopolis, also called Zosimos the Alchemist. Unlike his fellow alchemists, Zosimos sought to share his knowledge with the world. And in doing so, he created his legacy, perhaps not as a great scientist, but as a man who spread and disseminated the scientific knowledge of his time. Yet we know very little about Zosimos. We know only that he lived during the 4th century AD in Roman Egypt, at a time when Christianity gained ground. Though Zosimos embraced Christianity, he followed a sect called the Gnostics, which believed an evil lesser god created earth while God the Father reigned in heaven. Zosimos was born in a town called Panopolis, but spent most of his adult life in Alexandria, the second city of the Roman Empire and a center for learning and scholarship. He became most revered for writing one of the oldest alchemical books called Meta, which in Greek means things made with the hands. He wrote 9 other books, including one called the Book of Pictures. Zosimos of Panopolis provided one of the first public descriptions of alchemy. He called it the study of the composition of waters, movement, growth, drawing spirits from bodies, and bonding spirits within bodies. He understood alchemical work to be one of mental transformation and the gateway to spiritual salvation. He called his science Chemeia, an Egyptian word meaning black earth. He linked Chemeia to Chemis, one of the characters named in the Book of Enoch. Chemeia is the child of a fallen angel and a human woman. Since the Romans feared occultism as black magic, Zosimos put a different spin on it by writing about 2 different forms of Egyptian alchemy. One form Zosimos described as profane, centered on material gain and influenced by demons' doctrines. The other he saw as sacred, for it sought spiritual baptism. This tied in nicely with Roman ideas about good and bad magic, and so he allowed Egyptian alchemy to flourish under Roman rule. Zosimos of Panopolis believed that women received the gifts of metallurgy and chemistry given to them when fallen angels lusted after them and married them. This idea is in line with stories contained in the Book of Enoch, a sacred writing eventually not included in the Bible. Zosimos also believed that demons and their earthly servants wished to preserve the ignorance and spiritual enslavement of fallen humanity. Zosimos taught his students in Alexandria that spiritual man, or luminous man, had become trapped in Aristotle's 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which bound us to a wicked world ruled by Satan. Unsurprisingly, he believed that he and his fellow Egyptians received true science and wisdom from God, which would allow men to spurn worldly pleasures and demonic influence upon our lives and use sacred alchemy to liberate the spirit from evil worldly bonds. Part of Zosimos' understanding of alchemy, which centered on combining elements into alloys and compounds, much as modern chemists do, came to him in a dream in which Zosimos spoke to a priest standing in front of an altar. The priest declared he had been flayed and mangled, his flesh and bones burned. This ordeal transformed the priest's body into a pure spirit. Zosimos awoke from this dream believing that the four elements must go through a similar flaying in order to be transformed. When he fell asleep again, Zosimos saw the same place with the bowl-shaped altar now filled with boiling water and screaming people who died cruelly, while a man made of copper wrote upon an iron tablet. Zosimos interpreted this fantastic dream as telling him that giving and taking elements allowed for the transformation of all properties. While it sounds fantastic today, this basic idea of combining elements on the periodic table into compounds and alloys forms the basis of modern chemistry. The Egyptian also became the first to write of the object that obsessed scholars for centuries, the philosopher's stone. He called it a stone which is not a stone, a precious thing which has not value, a thing of many shapes which has no shape, the unknown thing which is known to all. Zosimos' writings pictured it as a dark and glassy substance which could turn lead into gold. Of course, Zosimos saw gold as the purest metal and that the philosopher's stone could purify humanity, restoring the immortality and innocence of the Garden of Eden. To carry out combinations of elements, which he called transmutation rather than chemistry, Zosimos described a range of instruments for distillation, sublimation, filtration, and fixation. Many of these instruments are adapted from cooking utensils or tools used in perfumery. Zosimos invented or modified some of them himself. Zosimos also served to combine and synthesize the writings of earlier alchemists who otherwise would have vanished into obscurity, most notably Maria Judea, whom Zosimos credited with developing a broad range of tools and techniques which would be used by alchemists throughout the medieval and Renaissance era. Just as a man eats to sustain life and might die, Maria Judea believed that metals could die, yet death only served as a change of form, like burned plants that become ashes. And though many of his ideas are now considered dubious today, Zosimos would influence scholars throughout the medieval and Renaissance era. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.